da-da-da, dun, da-da-da. Oh, keep it going.
Shalom, everyone. Man, I hope everyone had a great 4th of July. This year, America reached 250th.
America.
That's a milestone. Yes, America. America, rock and roll.
Yeah, I was just telling you, we were having some Hebrew National Kosher hot dogs, and they were good. And we had some burgers on the grill and all the fixins and grilled it all up. It was like 100 degrees out, but it was great.
Oh man, my neighbor had a friend that came with like a big crate full of all kinds of fireworks. I haven't fired a Roman candle since I was a kid.
Oh yeah. I didn't do any fireworks, but we watched them. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty good here. We watched some too. You know, I love where I live because right where they light the fireworks for the city, we're like literally a half a mile away from there. So we saw everything beautifully.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic.
Well, folks, welcome to another episode of the 613 Lifestyle. Man, we're at episode 47, Jeff.
Almost a year's gone by. Won't be too long. We'll have to do an anniversary show of some type.
Oh, yeah, we got to. And well, this week we will actually be concluding the dietary commands, and we're going to be diving deeper into clean and unclean. All right. Last week we went over. You know what? I never updated that part. I forgot what we went over last week. Well, last week we talked about birds that were edible and birds that weren't edible. We talked about chicken, how they ended up getting on the list. We also explored insects. You know, grasshoppers. Yeah, so if
it's funny, there was a dead locust on my porch today when I walked outside, and I looked at it. I couldn't identify what kind of locust it was, but it was dead. And I thought, well, can't eat it now. It's already dead.
Yeah, it's already dead. Actually, that's something we're going to cover today, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. Now, folks, go ahead if you are interested. If you've been following us and you're interested in the Torah list that we are doing, it is a unique list coming right out of this book called Torah for Modern Messiah Believers. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble for $19.99. And if you use that QR code, you can get it at a discounted price of $16.50. All right. Also, if all you want is just a copy of the list, you can email moderntorah@outlook.com. And we will be more than happy to email you a PDF with just the commandments listed. And I think it just has the introduction to the book. And that's it. We could do that for free. Once again, send your email to moderntorah@outlook.com. And we'll be happy to send you a free copy. All right. Now, for the past few weeks, we've been in Leviticus chapter 11. We told you this was not going to be a quick chapter. We were going to dive into this, and we have been.
Well, I think it's one of the most important topics in the scriptures for today. I believe.
I agree. You know, in the beginning, we started very simple with animals that we can eat and the rules that determine that, which is very simple. You know, split hooves, chew the cud. And then we also looked at fish that we can eat and can't eat. And then, you know, like we said already, we talked about birds that we can eat and insects that we can eat and can't eat. And today we will be rounding out what we can and cannot eat and go deeper into what makes us unclean. You know, so we have a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and get started with our first command. Actually, it's going to be two of them in one verse, which is command number 110 and command number 211.
210.
Oh, sorry, 210. Our apologies. Dyslexia. Command number 210 and numbers 211, which is both coming out of Leviticus chapter 11, verses 29 to 30. Right? And it reads, And these are unclean to you among the creeping creatures that creep on the earth, the mole and the mouse and the tortoise after its kind, and the gecko and the land crocodile and the sand reptile and the sand lizard and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that creeps. Anyone who touches them when they are dead becomes unclean until evening. All right? This is a negative command because it's telling us something to stay away from. This is definitely about loving Abba because this is defining what is clean and unclean according to him, right? And this is unconditional, right? These animals are still around on the earth. Nothing has changed, all right? Now, the command, the wording varies slightly depending on translations, but it's a list of several small creatures that, if they died, would make a person or object unclean through contact. Okay? Because some Hebrew animals' names are different to identify with certainty, translations do vary. The list generally includes a weasel or a mole, mouse, various kinds of large lizards, such as gecko, monitor lizards, crocodile or alligator, wall lizards, skink. I don't even know what a skink is, and a chameleon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's some type of lizard, the skink. But the main point is not the precise species, but that these ground-dwelling creatures belong to a category considered unclean. So why do translations differ? Well, reason is the Hebrew names for many of these animals occur very rarely in the Bible. I mean, I think they're basically listed here, and that makes their precise identification uncertain. As a result, older translations, such as the King James Version, may use names like ferret, even. Modern translations often use terms like gecko, monitor lizard, wall lizard, or simply various kinds of lizards. Scholars generally agree that this command refers to a group of small ground dwelling mammals and reptiles, even if the exact species cannot always be identified. When it comes to animals, big or small, if there are any questions, well, simply refer to the rules given to us in command number 200, which we covered last week in Leviticus 11, verses 2 and 3, where it talks about the split hooves and who chews the cud. Once again, the primary purpose of this command and all the commands found in Leviticus chapter 11 is to distinguish between what is clean and unclean, so Israel and us, because we are a part of Israel, right, can be holy, set apart for Elohim. There's two main important reasons behind these commands, and we should take some time to go over this. So number one, to be in the physical presence of Adonai. Once the tabernacle was completed, the presence of Adonai was physically seen as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. When Solomon built the temple, Israel saw that same presence go into the temple. Now, if you were unclean, you could not participate in services where you needed to be in the presence of Adonai. So last week, we also saw how these instructions for being unclean also prevented diseases from spreading within the congregation. Remember, they're all living close together in close quarters. There's millions of them now. And so they had to prevent these diseases from spreading within the congregation. The reasons for clean versus unclean was about being in the presence of Adonai. Israel has not been in this situation since before the Babylon exile. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where you are unclean today, practicing good hygiene is all that is needed to fix it. A case in point, Mike, I picked up that locust today. Now, I used a paper towel to pick it up. I didn't pick it up with my hand, but I looked at it. So I didn't really touch it, but I could be considered unclean until sundown today. So the second point about these commands, our Heavenly Father wants us to know the difference between what is holy and common, and between what is clean and unclean. The things that make us unclean in his eyes did not disappear with the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua. Since his people are currently scattered all around the world, the knowledge combined with our vigilance of keeping these commands can be a beacon of light, leading people to the one true Elohim of the universe in this dark world. This knowledge still sets us apart from the people of the world today, contributing to us to be a peculiar people. You know, some religious groups, right, Mike, they teach that these are suggestions. You know, there is nothing suggestive about the commands of Adonai. It's black and white. Do or don't do. This command, or this second reason, is why Leviticus 11 is still relevant today for all those who believe in the Elohim who raised Yeshua from the dead. If you don't believe in him, then there's no possible reason that you really believe in Yeshua. So what does unclean really mean? Let's get into that. If you've been watching us now for some time, you're probably wondering why we repeat this so much. Well, some people could be new to the podcast and maybe they've not watched previous episodes yet, but another reason is because many people simply do not understand what unclean means and usually believe that unclean and sin, unclean and sin, they believe they're like interchangeable. But that is not true. That's far from the truth. Touching the carcass of something is not a sin. All right. If I touch the carcass of the locust today that was dead, I didn't sin. Okay. It just makes you unclean for a period of time. So, you know, sometimes you can encounter such carcasses by mistake, like I did. I just got up in the morning, walked out the door, and there it was, even without knowing. And there are times when you have no choice. In fact, aside from eating what you are not supposed to eat, none of the things that make you unclean are sinful. They're simply just a part of life. Women get unclean once a month, and they're, you know, when they have their period, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a pet that is part of the family and it dies, chances are you will touch the body at least once. Unclean does not mean sinful or that you're morally evil. During the time when Abba's presence was physically in the midst of his people, someone who became unclean by touching one of these dead animals would be temporary, excluded from certain worship activities, and they needed to wash and wait until evening before being considered clean again, as described in the surrounding verses that we are reading today. Yeah. So I'll let you pick it up here, Mike.
All right. Now let's continue on here. In verse 31, it actually says these animals are unclean. Anyone who touches their dead body becomes unclean until evening, okay? And this is very important to note here, all right? Notice that the emphasis is on contact with the dead animal, all right? Not merely seeing them or being near a living one, right? It is also important to note that if you touch them while they are alive, that does nothing. It doesn't make you unclean, all right? Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate that there are some religious groups out there that teach that. You know, this whole chapter teaches us that holiness is something we need to constantly be aware of, all right? Holiness is not just for worship during Shabbat services, the feasts, or the appointed times. You know, it is something that keeps you aware. I mean, just by going through this command, you know, it makes you aware now, going through this whole chapter, that, okay, you know, swarming creatures are unclean, and it makes you aware. Mm-hmm. God wants you to have that knowledge, you know? Now let's look at the next command on our list here, which is command number 212. And this is coming out of Leviticus chapter 11 again, verses 32 to 38. And it reads, and whatever any of them in its dead state falls upon becomes unclean. Whether it is any wooden object or garment or skin or sack, any object in which work is done, it is put in water, and it shall be unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean. Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, whatever is in it becomes unclean, and you break it. Any of the food which might be eaten, on which water comes, becomes unclean, and any drink which might be drunk from it becomes unclean. And on whatever any of their carcasses falls becomes unclean, and an oven or cooking range, it is broken down. Okay, and we'll cover that one momentarily. They are unclean and are unclean to you. But the fountain or a well, a collection of water, is clean. But whatever touches their carcass is unclean. And when any of their carcass falls on any planting seeds, which is to be sown, it is clean. But when any water is put on the seed, and any part of any such carcass falls on it, it is unclean to you. Man, that's a lot.
Yeah.
A lot in there. Obviously, this is positive command, something we need to do. Definitely loving Abba. And again, it is unconditional. Okay? Now, Leviticus chapter 11, verses 32 to 38 goes into specifically what happens when the carcass of certain unclean animals come into contact with objects, food, water, or seeds. Once again, becoming unclean was not necessarily a sin, but it required specific responses before someone could participate in worship. Here's a breakdown of this command. All right. Verses 32 to 35 talks about objects made unclean by a dead, unclean animal. Okay. This part of the command says that if the carcass of one of the designated unclean creatures falls on an object, that object becomes unclean, right? Examples include wooden utensils, clothing, leather items, sackcloth, any tools used for work. The required response was that you wash the item with water. It remains unclean until evening, and then after that, it becomes clean again. Very simple. However, earthenware, clay vessels are treated differently. If the carcass falls inside a clay pot, everything in it becomes unclean. The pot itself must be broken rather than washed. And there was one part, that talked about where was it? Collection of water. Talks about stoves, ovens. Keep in mind, back then, those type of things were actually created with clay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so which is why it's said that those would need to be destroyed as well.
Right, because many scholars, Mike, they think this reflects the porous nature of ancient clay pottery, which absorbed the impurities and was difficult to cleanse. You couldn't get it out of the porous material. So disease could breed in there. And so the Lord is saying, get off. You can't get the bacteria. You can't clean it. So break it down and dispose of it. And that's what you had to do. So, and people today, they still use a wide variety of earthenware, okay? Clay cooking vessels, both for traditional cuisines and everyday home cooking. So let's go over it. There's a lot of these main categories, and wherever you are around the world that you're listening to us, let's go through some of them. You'll probably be familiar with many of them. So we have your typical clay pot, and that could be unglazed or glazed. And these round pots, they're used for stews, soups, beans, curries, and slow-cooked dishes. They're common in many parts of the world. Then you have clay casseroles dishes. Those are covered baking dishes designed for ovens. They retain moisture. They distribute heat gently. Then you have tagines. So a tagine is a traditional conical clay pot used for slow cooking meats, vegetables, and spices. Then you have Adonabe. Adonabe is a Japanese clay pot used for rice, hot pots, soups, and braises. You may see them in restaurants. And you have bean pots, right? We're familiar with the old bean pots. These are deep clay vessels traditionally used for long, slow cooking of beans. And then you have this Romertov style bakers. These are porous clay roasting vessels that are soaked before they use them to create steam during baking, right? Then you have a kazu, I don't know how you pronounce this one, a cazuelas. A cazuelas is a shallow earthenware dish used on the stove top or in the oven for casseroles, seafood, and rice dishes. Then you have a handi. A handi is a round bellied pot traditionally used for curries, biryani, and slow cooked meats in many Indian households. Then you have a shamas or shambas cookware. La shamba is a cookware that includes pots, casseroles, and serving dishes made from black clay. Then you have the terracotta. Many of us are familiar with terracotta baking dishes, flat, shallow vessels used for roasting vegetables, baking bread, or preparing gratins. Then you have clay bread clutches. These are dome-shaped earthenware vessels that trap steam. And then we have my favorite, the pizza stone or the baking stone. While not vessels in the traditional sense, they're still ceramic or fire clay slabs used to bake bread and pizza with crisp crust. Now, here's some other traditional examples still in use around the world today. You have the guvek, which is from Turkey. You have the olla, which is in Spain, Latin America. You have the barro cookware in Mexico. You have the paleoc, which is in the Philippines. You have the maca, which is in India. And, a lot of people are still cooking with this stuff around the world, and they probably have no recollection of these type of commands, and they may be getting sick and they don't even realize it and they don't know why. And here, they could be experiencing some of these dead animals or, being brought into, falling into their pots and their earthenware.
Yeah.
So, and then we have what you read earlier, Mike, verses in verse 36 and 37, talking about the flowing water, okay, in the seeds. So this text makes an important distinction, right? So the springs and cisterns, a spring or a large body of collected water does not become unclean if a carcass falls into it. Don't you find that fascinating that the water itself is not unclean if it's a spring and a large body of collected water? But the person who removes the carcass becomes unclean. But the water source itself remains usable, right? Because it's flowing water.
Yeah.
This likely reflects the practical necessity of preserving essential water supplies for the community. All body of water out in nature has something dead in it, right? Without this very important clarification, Israel wouldn't be able to drink water at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, like I said, it's flowing water, it's different, because it has a source. It's constantly going around, which makes a lot of sense, and a part of me, when I was going through that, a part of me makes me wonder, for a while, maybe the Heavenly Father does something, miraculously, supernaturally, that makes the water not get contaminated,
Well, I don't know, Mike, but when I was growing up, I lived by the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania, and I used to take bottled the jugs of water and go up to the spring, and we had a pipe stuck in the side of the mountain or the hill, and the water would flow out. It was spring water, and that water, I traced it one time. I went up, and it went underground, above ground, underground, above ground. There was moss, and there was the rocks. All that stuff cleanses that water. And I would just go home and filter it out with a coffee filter and drink it. It was the best tasting water you ever could drink.
Oh, man. And I've had some drink. I've had some clean water before like that. It is awesome. Man, all right, let's move on here. The next part that this command talked about was dry seeds, okay? And it said that if a carcass touches seeds intended for planting while it is still dry, the seed remains clean. And I thought about this. It made perfect sense because seeds are usually in a husk of some sort, right?
Mm.
And then you put them in the ground and water them, and then they come out of that husk. So that would make sense because it's what's inside the seed that counts and it's still being protected, right? And then in verse 38, it talks about wet seeds, right? If water has already been put on the seed and then the carcass touches it, the seed becomes unclean. Now, one common explanation is that moisture makes the seed or grain susceptible to contracting impurities from the carcass, right? Which makes sense. This principle later becomes an important concept in Jewish interpretations of purity laws, right? Now, there are several themes that emerge in this command, all right? A few of them are holiness through distinction. This is a theme that we've been saying since the beginning of chapter 11 of Leviticus. You know, the laws teach Israel and all of us to distinguish between clean and unclean in many areas of daily life. It also goes into practicalities. Not everything is treated the same. You know, valuable necessities like springs remain usable, while inexpensive clay pots are just, well, they were inexpensive back then. Today, have you seen some of the prices? Oh my gosh. Yeah, you know, but but that was the distinction of that time, you know. It also goes into the knowledge of unclean rather than hygiene. All right. And this is something else that we pointed out last week. Although some regulations may have incidental health benefits, the primary concern is purity, not necessarily disease prevention, although we can clearly see the benefit of how it prevents disease, right? And then another theme here is attention to ordinary life, everyday activities, handling tools, storing food, planting crops, and using water are all connected to Israel's covenant relationship with Adonai. And these are things that we have to focus and deal with every day. You
Mhm.
know, in Judaism, these verses are a part of a broader system of Tumah, which is ritual impurity, in Teraha, Taraha. I can never pronounce that correctly, which is ritual purity. You know, these commands were relevant when the temple in Jerusalem was standing because ritual purity affected participation in temple worship, you know, which we've covered a few times. You know, this commandment here, Leviticus 11, 32 to 38, illustrates a carefully structured system for maintaining ritual purity for ancient Israel, balancing balancing concerns about holiness with practical rules for everyday living. All
Mm.
right. Now let's look at our next command here, which is command number 213. And this is coming out of Leviticus 11, verses 39 to 40. Right. And it reads, and when any of the beasts which are yours for food dies, he who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. And he who eats of its carcass has to wash his garments and shall be unclean until evening. And he who picks up its carcass has to wash his garments and shall be unclean until evening. Okay? Negative command, something to stay away from. Once again, loving Abba, and this is unconditional. Now, let's really pay attention to what's happening here. Okay? The passage is actually distinguishing, excuse me, between two situations. Okay, an animal properly slaughtered for food, and an animal that dies on its own or out in the wild, not necessarily by man's hands. Okay. Now, we've already covered the sacrifices, and we know that an animal properly slaughtered for food, it could be eaten, of course, according to Torah. And in this situation, the carcass of the animal can be touched for various obvious reasons, such as if you're cooking, you need to touch the meat, to prep it. Or, in ancient times when there was a temple, to prepare for sacrifice. Remember, we went over how the people bringing the sacrifices, they were doing the butchering and they had to put all the pieces together. They had to touch the carcass to do that. So in that situation, it's clean. Okay,
Right.
it's good to touch. But what happens if an animal dies in the wilderness? Right? That's what this is actually talking about. Even if it belongs to a clean species, such as the sheep, goat, or cow, its carcass conveys uncleanness. So now we are getting a different layer here to be cautious. If you catch a dead cow out there, that it is unclean.
Oh, absolutely. And this is so important to bring this out because people are thinking always, okay, well, what about the animals that you slaughter for the sacrifices? Are they clean? Are you now clean or unclean? Or are the animals clean or unclean? It's like, no. So we make a distinction here. The Torah is very clear on this. So
Yeah.
this Hebrew phrase refers to an animal that dies naturally or otherwise not through proper slaughter. If it dies naturally, you don't know what it died of. Could be old age, could be disease, could have been killed by a predator. We don't know. And then when it dies, there may be stuff that festers in the meat and whatever. It hasn't been bled out properly. So why was this rule given? Well, scholars and Jewish interpreters have suggested several complementary reasons. So one, it's respect for life and holiness. Death is often associated with ritual impurity in the Torah, while Adonai is the source of life. And then we get into public health. Animals that died naturally may have died from disease or injury, making them unsafe to eat, just like I said. And then covenant identity. These laws help set Israel apart as a people who practice holiness in everyday life. Now, the text itself emphasizes holiness. But a few verses later, Adonai says, what does he say? Be holy because I am holy. From Leviticus 11, verses 44 and 45. And a similar rule appears in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21, which prohibits Israelites from eating an animal that died naturally, but allows it to be given or sold to a foreigner. Now that's peculiar. This highlights that the prohibition is tied to the covenant relationship with Abba. Leviticus 11, verses 39 and 40 teaches that even a clean animal becomes a source of ritual impurity if it dies naturally, and anyone who handles or eats its carcass undergoes a temporary purification process before returning to a state of ritual cleanness. So that's very, very insightful for our listeners here to take note of.
And one thing before you go on, I gotta say this. It does say if you eat it, you will be unclean until evening, which also shows how yes, Israel has these commands, but the Heavenly Father understands that you may come into a situation where you might not have a choice. If you see a dead carcass of a cow, a sheep, or goat, if you can clean, drain the blood, do everything, you might need to eat it, which I thought was mercy.
Right. And just not throwing it away if it's still good.
Yeah.
Well, our next command is command number 214, which is from Leviticus 11, continuing with verses 41 and 42. It reads in Leviticus 11:41, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth is an abomination. it shall not be eaten. Whatever goes on its belly, and whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet, even all creeping things that creep on the earth, them you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. Now, this is, of course, a negative command, but it's loving Abba and it's unconditional. Where it says every creeping thing that creeps on the earth is an abomination, that Hebrew word translating creeping thing is sharetz, which means referring to creatures that swarm or crawl along the ground. This includes animals such as snakes, worms, lizards, mice, insects that crawl, and similar small ground dwelling creatures. Now, the Hebrew word shechetz is where we get the English word abomination. In this context, it means these creatures were detestable as food for Israel. It's not saying that these animals are evil or that God did not create them or love them, because he created all things that he created as good, but they are not good for food. They have other purposes.
Yeah.
So they were not to be eaten under the covenant laws given to Israel. Now, verse 42 expands at the prohibition by describing these different types of movement. He says, whatever goes on its belly. Okay, that's speaking of snakes, worms, and other similar creatures. Whatever goes on all fours, that would be crawling animals that move close to the ground. Whatever has many feet, creatures such as centipedes and millipedes. Some of them are poisonous if you get bit by one of them or you try to handle one of those.
Oh, yeah.
So the Lord has taken everything into account, Mike. I mean, it's just fascinating, the detail that the Lord has given us.
Oh yeah, and I mean, just think about it. The details that he's putting here tells you that these were not just things that just came up off the top of his head. Mm-hmm. He planned these all out. He is truly the architect of architects.
Oh man, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Now this wording is meant to cover the entire category of ground crawling creatures, regardless of their exact species. Now, why these animals? The chapter is less concerned with biology than with holiness. Okay? Throughout Leviticus 11, Abba teaches Israel to distinguish between what is clean and unclean. The dietary commands serve as daily reminders that we belong to him. Here is a connection worth noticing. Just before this passage, right, we went over verse 20 to 23. The law permits certain hopping insects, right, such as specific kinds of locusts, right? Then we go to verse 41 to 42, which prohibit ground crawling creatures. The distinction shows that the Torah classifies animals according to the categories established within the command itself, not actually according to modern zoology. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now, Leviticus 11, 41 to 42 teaches us that ground crawling creatures were not to be eaten by the Israelites. Abomination refers to these status as forbidden food, not to their intrinsic worth as part of Adonai's creation. As Jeff said, they're all good. God, he cares for all his creations. It's kind of like, the people that make Crayola crayons, they didn't make them for children to eat. In the same sense, these creatures that are on this earth are designed for a reason that has nothing to do with us eating them. Okay? And then this command also reinforces the broader purpose of Leviticus 11, to train Israel in holiness and obedience by making a distinction between what was clean and what was unclean. Okay? Let's look at our next command here on our list, which is command number 218 and 219, which all comes from Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44, right? There's two commandments here, right? The first commandment is, for I am Adonai your Elohim, sanctify yourself therefore and be holy, for I am holy. And then the second part is, you shall not defile yourself with any kind of creeping thing that moves on the earth, right? So here we got a positive command and a negative command, right? The first one is a positive command. The second part is the negative command. And they're both about loving Abba, and they're unconditional, okay? Now, this is repeated 5 times in Leviticus 11:45, Leviticus 19:2, Leviticus 27, Leviticus 20:26, Deuteronomy 7:6. And there is one more in the Brit Hadashah where Yeshua says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's basically saying the same thing, okay? Now, contrary to popular belief, this command is not a standalone thought, okay? It is usually tied to a series of teachings, and we're talking about the first part here, the 218 part, right? Is usually tied to a series of teachings and is used as an anchor statement, right? That if we do all these instructions related to it, then Adonai will see us as set apart for him, okay? Like, for example, like we're coming towards the end of this chapter, right? And he's gone over a whole bunch of things for us to eat, not to eat, and gone over things that make us abominable, things that make us unclean. And now he's saying, be holy as I am holy, right? He's not saying, oh, you need to be perfect. This is not a standalone statement. He is basically saying, if you do everything I just told you to do, you will be set apart as I am set apart. That's what he's saying, right? And we can see this throughout various instructions. We went over 120, 218, 220 are connected to the dietary instructions, right? We're going to get to 220 eventually, right? Instructions in avoiding swarming insects. That's what that statement meant. So if you avoid swarming insects, you will be holy, right? Later on, when we get to command number 270 in Leviticus 19:2, it begins a series of commands about one another relationships, right? And then he ends that with, be holy for I am holy. Talking about if you do these one another relationships, you will be holy like me, right? When we next see this command in Leviticus 27, it comes at the heels of Adonai speaking against things done for Molech, right? He says to stay away from these things, and if you do so, you will be holy as I am holy, And with command number 337, right? To be set apart is tied to keeping his commandments, not following the ways of the nations and distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. I don't remember which command that is, but we'll get to it eventually. And finally, we last see this teaching in Deuteronomy 7:6, where Moses reminds us that we are a set apart people, unto Adonai, becoming his love, because he loves us and because of the promises made to Abraham. So be holy as he is holy. And I find it ridiculous because a lot of people get those verses and they got tunnel vision. They see that one verse and they're like, well, I can't be perfect. No, read it in context and you'll understand why he says that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that about wraps up this series of commands right here. I still got a little bit of time left here, Mike. Next week we're going to be closing out Leviticus chapter 11, and the chapter ends with the perfect exclamation point that sums up the entire chapter masterfully. So far, we hope you've seen just how important this information is for believers today. As we said, this is the introduction of Leviticus chapter 11, and these commands are just as vital as do not murder and do not steal, because they are instructions for how we can be holy and set apart for the one true God, the one true Elohim of the universe. When we apply the knowledge found in Leviticus chapter 11, we are properly exercising his faith. Now, next week, Mike, not tomorrow because I follow you tomorrow's podcast, but I'm going through that series, The Dark Ages. Next week, it ties right into what we're talking about here in Leviticus 11. I'm going to be going through the Black Plague, the Black Death during the Dark Ages, and how not applying the principles that we just talked about here the last 2 weeks, especially today, led to such the spread of disease and so much death in Europe during the Dark Ages. And then how they blamed it, started to blame it on the Jews because they were not dying like the rest of Europe was, because they were practicing clean hygiene in the Torah, in the commands and the laws that we just went over here today. So don't think that this doesn't apply to us today, because go touch a dead thing and then don't wash your hands, and then the next thing you know, you got some disease or you're sick. The principles that we have gone through here today are just as applicable for today than they were thousands of years ago. The Torah
Amen.
is alive, and it's always living. It's a living Torah.
Amen. And one of the things I want to wrap up, since we have extra time here, from the beginning of this whole series, we talked about that this is not a command that's been done away with, right? None of the commands in Leviticus chapter 11 are done away with, because it's all about the knowledge of being clean and unclean. Now, of course, today, and we brought it up last week and the week before that, we don't have a temple. We are not in a situation where the Heavenly Father is physically in our presence. Okay. But just washing yourself, if you just being aware of the clean and unclean commands and just washing yourself, that will make him happy. All right. And this kind of goes into what I, hoping we would have time to go over, which we do, is the word worship. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, many of us comes into this walk through Christianity, right? And we have been ingrained to believe that worship is when people are playing music, you got your hands up in the air, praising God and all that. But according to the Bible, worship is much more than singing, praying, or attending religious gatherings, okay? At its core, worship is recognizing who God is and responding to him with reverence, with love, obedience, and wholehearted devotion, right? It is both an inward attitude as well as an outward way of life, okay? Mm-hmm. And this is why Leviticus chapter 11 is so important and relevant to us today, right? Worship begins with recognizing God's worth. If he says, don't eat these things, are you valuing his worth, or are you devaluing him? See what I'm saying?
Right. Absolutely.
These are things that people got to think about. The English word worship actually comes from the idea of worthship, declaring. It's declaring someone's worth, okay? In scripture, worship is acknowledging that God alone is worthy because he is the creator, the sustainer, and the redeemer, right? We got, like Psalms 29:2 says, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, right? And in Psalms 145, verse 3, it says, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, right? True worship starts with seeing God for who he is. Once again, if you believe that Torah is done away with, are you truly seeing him for who he is? Worship involves bowing and reverence and submission. Okay, that is the key part here. Worshiping him in everything that we do. This is why we kept saying throughout this today's message, that we worship him through obedience.
That's right. I was just looking up Matthew 15 in verse 8. And actually in verse, at the beginning, but he's talking about the commandments. And then he says, these people draw near to me with their mouth, but their heart is far from me. He says, the people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right that worshiping Yeshua, worshiping God, comes from obedience.
Yeah. And worship is serving God with your whole life. Worship is not just when we get together for Shabbats and get together for the feast or the Moedim. Worship is every day revolving how you think and how you view the world and saying whatever God says is right.
Yeah, it's part of the Shema. It's worship him and keep his commands, and with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind.
Yeah, you can't worship him part-time. It has to be done wholeheartedly. And these commands in Leviticus 11 shows us that even in everyday things, we are still worshiping him. When we choose not to eat pork or shrimp because he says so, that is worshiping him. When we find a wallet in the street filled with money, and we get the address and we go and we find the person that it belongs to, that is worshiping him because he says so.
That's right.
When we stay away from what he says is unclean, that is worshiping him. Amen. We need to get this idea that worship is just, singing music and raising your hands. That's not worship at all. Man, I could keep going on. This could be another message in and of itself. But we're going to go ahead and end it right here.
We're out of time now.
We're out of time. Thank you guys for watching another episode of the 613 Lifestyle. You can follow us on the MessianicLandRadio.com. Also, you can follow us on YouTube, 3 different channels. There's the Daily Torah, which is Jeff's channel, Modern Torah, which is my channel, and of course, there is the Messianic Lamb Network channel. If you got comments, questions, prayer requests, definitely send them to moderntorah@outlook.com. Thank you once again for following along with us, and I wish you all a great week. Shalom.
All right. Shalom Aleichem, everyone.
If you missed today's show or want to watch it again or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find this show and all other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell somebody about the Messianic Lamb Network.